Dr. Gideon Harper was not a fan of human enthusiasm. Especially not the kind that was floating around the shuttle as it glided through the cold, infinite stretch of space toward Anus Prime. He'd seen this kind of behavior before, people excited by the idea of the unknown, eager to set foot on a new world and claim it as their own, without a shred of understanding of what they were getting into. It was almost funny. Almost. First colony on an uncharted planet, one of the colonists, an overly eager young man named Jacob, shouted from the back of the cabin. His eyes were practically sparkling with anticipation. "This is history in the making, right? I mean, we're the pioneers." Pioneers. That was the word. Gideon had heard it 100 times in the last 3 days. He'd lost count of how many speeches about humanity's inevitable march into space he'd heard since boarding the ship, and they all carried the same intoxicating optimism. What they didn't seem to realize was that optimism was about to run headlong into a brick wall of the unknown. As he adjusted his seatbelt, he tried to tune out Jacob and the rest of the colony hopefuls, who were busy discussing things like the soil composition on Anus Prime and whether the trees would have leaves shaped like Earth's evergreens or, perhaps, something more exotic. Gideon wasn't concerned with the trees. "I've studied the preliminary reports on Anus Prime," he said, leaning back in his chair, trying his best to hide the frustration in his voice. "The planet's ecosystem is stable, yes, but too stable. It's almost too perfect." The colonists, of course, weren't listening. One of them, a woman with a name tag that read Mira, a bioengineer, looked up from her tablet with a smile that was just a touch too bright. "That's a good thing, right?" she asked, fiddling with her tablet. "I mean, we've been looking for a planet just like this one with an already established biosphere. It's ideal for colonization." Gideon couldn't help but snort softly. He adjusted his glasses, the weight of the mission pressing on him now more than ever. He wasn't going to burst their bubble just yet. But if they thought that ideal meant a life of peaceful exploration and agricultural development, they were in for a rude awakening. "Sure, it's ideal," he said, half to himself, as he glanced out the shuttle window. The vast, dark expanse of space stretched before them, the stars twinkling like scattered diamonds, but it was the planet Anus Prime that held his gaze. It was a glowing orb, larger than Earth's moon but smaller than Earth itself, with a faint greenish hue to its atmosphere. Anus Prime was a curiosity. But curiosity was often dangerous. And Gideon knew too well that humans, in their rush to claim, often ignored the warning signs. When the shuttle finally landed on Anus Prime, the colonists poured out in a rush of excitement. Their boots hit the soft, moss-covered ground, and they exhaled in wonder at the strange, alien beauty around them. Giant, iridescent trees rose like towering spires, their massive trunks winding like serpents and their leaves shimmering with a variety of colors, shifting from deep blues to glowing purples as if in response to the sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of unfamiliar flowers, and the air was thick with the hum of distant, unseen creatures. The planet felt alive, vibrant, and it made Gideon's stomach twist in that familiar way that always preceded a discovery he wasn't quite ready to make. The shuttle crew was already setting up base camp, unloading supplies. Amidst the flurry of activity, the colony's head administrator, Colonel Victor Mills, approached Gideon, his uniform crisp and military-grade despite the rough terrain. "Well, Harper, what do you think?" Mills asked, his voice full of that typical military bravado. "Does it look like paradise to you?" Gideon glanced around, eyes narrowing as he took in the alien landscape. The colonists were setting up tents, their laughter and chatter filling the air, but in the back of his mind, he heard the warning bells ring. "It all seemed too perfect." "It looks too perfect," Gideon said. "The plants, the animals, it's like everything is too in sync with each other. It almost looks like someone designed it." Mills chuckled, slapping him on the back in a way that was supposed to be friendly but came off as condescending. "You always have an eye for the unusual, don't you, Harper? I'm sure there's a logical explanation. I'm looking forward to seeing what you can dig up. Just keep the team focused, all right? We need this to be a success." We're on the clock here. Gideon didn't respond. Instead, he turned his attention to the vast wilderness beyond the camp. The colonists were eager to dive into the unknown, but he was more cautious. Anus Prime didn't feel like the untouched paradise they thought it was. There was something unsettling about its symmetry, its unnatural balance. He could feel it in his bones. "All right, everyone," Mills called, gathering the colonists around. "First order of business, start the initial surveys, set up the communications relay. Let's see if this planet's going to be a home or just another pit stop." Gideon followed the group toward the small clearing where they'd set up their first research station. They'd come with grand plans: soil samples, water testing, crop rotation experiments. But in the back of his mind, Gideon couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into a trap. By the second week, the colonists were already well into their work. The first crops had been planted, and the weather remained eerily calm. Even the sky, usually a fickle thing, seemed to cooperate, with the sun rising and setting exactly on schedule. The first nightfall was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional rustling of trees in the wind. Gideon sat alone in his small quarters, flipping through data from his first few environmental samples. Everything seemed to align perfectly with Earth-like biospheres, but there were discrepancies. The soil composition was unlike any Earth soil he had worked with, and the planet's atmospheric conditions were too stable. Things grew quickly, sure, but they were almost too adaptable. The plants responded to changes in light and moisture with an intensity that didn't match their evolutionary models. Then, as he flipped through his notes, he found the first anomaly. The trees, some of them weren't just growing in place. They were moving. Gideon's mind raced. At first, he thought it was a glitch in his scanner, a trick of the light or some temporary atmospheric interference. But as he studied the data closer, he realized the truth: the trees' roots were shifting. It wasn't a one-time occurrence either. Every few hours, the roots would rearrange themselves, creeping along the ground and making subtle adjustments to their positioning. There was no way this could be natural. The next day, the weather began to change. It started small: a slight drop in temperature, a few unusual gusts of wind. The colonists, for the most part, brushed it off. After all, they were on an uncharted planet. Unusual things were to be expected. But when the temperature plummeted overnight and strange clouds began to form in the sky, the atmosphere around the camp shifted. Panic began to spread. Gideon's first priority was to investigate the trees. He had to confirm what he was seeing. But when he reached the clearing, he found something far worse than he had anticipated. The trees were no longer just shifting their roots, they were reacting. A massive, translucent vine shot out from one of the trees, wrapping itself around a nearby rock formation. It was like watching an animal strike. It was swift, deliberate, and disturbingly intelligent. As it wrapped around the rock, the vine seemed to learn. It adjusted its grip and tightened its hold, as if it could understand the structure of the rock itself. Gideon stepped back, his heart racing. This wasn't just an ecosystem. This wasn't a natural biosphere. It was designed. He rushed back to the colony to warn them. That evening, the first storm hit. It came out of nowhere, with violent winds and crackling lightning that wasn't natural at all. The trees swayed unnaturally, their roots twisting deeper into the soil as if trying to escape, and then, the ground shook. The storm hit with a violence that was almost human. By the time the first flash of lightning tore through the sky, the colony was in chaos. Tents and equipment flew across the camp like confetti, their aluminum frames bent and twisted as if made of paper. The wind screamed, as though the planet itself was furious at the intrusion. It was more than just a storm. It was a warning. Gideon stood at the edge of the chaos, feeling the sharp sting of rain against his skin. He watched in disbelief as the bioluminescent trees, those once glowing wonders, swayed like they had a mind of their own. Their roots twisted violently under the soil, emerging from the ground in long, tendril-like shapes. One vine shot into the sky like a living whip, striking the horizon with a crack that split the air. It wasn't a storm anymore. It was a reckoning, Gideon. Get inside, someone screamed. It was Mira, her hair plastered to her face, her eyes wide with fear. He didn't move. He couldn't. Something in him, some deep, primal instinct told him to stay put. Something was happening, something that had been brewing long before humanity set foot on this planet. The ground beneath his feet quivered again, and this time it wasn't just the storm. He could feel it, an unsettling pulse, like the very planet was alive, reacting to their presence. Gideon. Mira shouted again, but this time her voice was drowned by the howling wind. He turned toward her, and for a moment, it felt like the world had frozen. She was staring at something, eyes wide, filled with a fear that matched his own. He followed her gaze, and then he saw it. From the center of the forest, something was moving. It wasn't a tree. It wasn't a creature. It was something else, something massive, something unnatural. A figure tall, angular, and impossibly alien emerged from the shadows. It was translucent, its skin like liquid glass, shimmering in the dim light of the storm. It moved effortlessly, as if the wind itself bent around it. Its shape was almost humanoid, but wrong. So wrong. Gideon's heart skipped a beat. He'd only heard rumors about such things, ancient relics, myths of a long-forgotten species that once called Anus Prime home. But standing before him now, in the center of the storm, was a being that could only be described as one of the Anusans, a member of the lost, ancient civilization that had built this world. Get back. Run. Gideon yelled, but Mira didn't hear him. She was frozen, staring at the figure in awe and terror. Then, the figure spoke. It wasn't a voice, not really. It was more like a presence, an overwhelming pressure that filled his mind, like an echo bouncing off every wall of his consciousness. It wasn't words. It was understanding, a message that didn't need language to be communicated. You have disturbed the balance. The voice, if you could call it that, reverberated in his skull, sending a shockwave of dread through his entire body. Gideon's legs shook, and his mind spun in a blur of confusion. The Anusans were supposed to be gone, long extinct, their civilization lost to time. But this was something else. Something far more dangerous. Mira stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the creature. What do you want?" she whispered. "You are intruders. You do not belong." It was as though the words came from everywhere, from the trees, from the ground, from the very air. Gideon's breath hitched in his chest. The storm had stopped, but the planet itself felt alive, waiting, watching, and then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished back into the forest. The wind died down. The trees fell silent. For a long moment, no one spoke. The camp was in ruins. Equipment was scattered across the ground, some of it twisted beyond recognition, but it was the destruction of the world itself that left everyone speechless. Mira was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling. "What the hell was that?" Gideon swallowed hard, trying to calm the beating of his heart. It wasn't just the storm. It wasn't natural. "What do you mean?" "That thing, it wasn't natural either. It was alive. And it was trying to communicate." Gideon nodded, feeling the weight of the truth settle over him. "I think we've awakened something. Something we weren't meant to find." The next few days were filled with panic. The once hopeful colonists were now scattered, unsure of what they had unleashed. Some insisted it was just a freak accident, a freak storm, a bizarre atmospheric phenomenon. Others, though, couldn't deny what they had seen. The very air had shifted, the plants had moved. The Anusans had left something behind, a defense mechanism, a system meant to protect this world from invaders. And the invaders had arrived. Gideon, however, wasn't so quick to jump to conclusions. He'd spent the last 2 days combing through his research, trying to make sense of what was happening. The trees weren't just shifting, they were reacting to the changes in the environment. The soil wasn't just rich, it was alive, metabolizing changes in ways that went far beyond simple biology. And those vines, those twisted, sentient tendrils, they weren't just part of the flora. They were designed, the Anusans had engineered Anus Prime, every plant, every animal, every rock and cloud. They had created a living ecosystem, a biosecurity system that filtered out invaders, destroyed foreign life forms, and maintained the planet's delicate balance. The arrival of humans had disrupted everything. Gideon didn't know if it was too late to stop the destruction, but he was going to try it. He gathered a small group of the remaining colonists, the ones who still believed there was a way out. Mira was among them, along with Captain Elena Brooks, a seasoned officer who had been more skeptical than most but had come to trust Gideon's judgment. I think we need to find the source, Gideon said. The Anusans left something behind. A structure, a device, something that controls the planet. We need to find it before it's too late. You think it's still here? Elena asked, her brow furrowed. I don't think it's gone. I think it's buried beneath the surface. Whatever it is, it's been dormant for centuries, waiting for someone to disturb it. Mira nodded, her face pale but determined. And if we find it? We stop it. We find a way to turn it off. If we don't, this entire colony will be wiped out. They set off into the forest, the sounds of the storm still fresh in their ears, the landscape eerily silent now. As they ventured deeper, the trees became even stranger. Some were glowing with a strange internal light, others swayed as if moved by an unseen wind. And all the while, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shift, the roots twisting and tangling as though alive, following them, watching. After several hours of navigating through dense undergrowth and strange flora, they finally found what they were looking for. Hidden in a clearing was a structure unmistakably artificial, yet so ancient it looked like it had been part of the planet itself. It was made of a smooth, metallic material, covered in what appeared to be alien runes. The structure seemed to hum, like a machine that had just been awakened. This is it, Gideon said, stepping forward. This is the heart of the planet. As his hand touched the metal, the ground trembled beneath them. The structure lit up, and the runes began to glow with an eerie green light. They weren't just symbols, they were instructions, a language, a blueprint for how the ecosystem was controlled. They were witnessing the remains of a civilization that had bent nature itself to its will. And then, the vines struck, massive tendrils shot up from the ground, wrapping around their legs, pulling them toward the structure. Gideon fought against them, but the force was overwhelming. The colonists screamed as the roots tightened, pulling them into the earth. You have disturbed us. The voice filled their minds again, the presence of the Anusan entity flooding their thoughts. Gideon's eyes widened as the realization hit him. This wasn't just a defense mechanism. It was a living weapon, and now, they were its prey. The vines coiled tighter, their thick, sinewy strands creeping up their bodies with terrifying speed. Gideon's heart raced as the tendrils dug into his legs, pulling him toward the glowing structure in the center of the clearing. He struggled against them, but the strength of the vines was beyond anything he had ever experienced. Mira screamed as one of the vines wrapped around her waist, lifting her off the ground. Hold on! Gideon shouted, reaching out for her. But the vines were everywhere, moving with a singular, terrifying purpose. They weren't just pulling them, and they were feeding on them. The energy from their bodies seemed to be siphoned away as the roots tightened. We have to stop it. Elena gasped, her voice barely audible over the increasing hum of the structure. We need to shut it down. Gideon's eyes darted around, looking for any way to break free. The metallic structure in the center of the clearing pulsed with that eerie green light, the runes etched into its surface flashing like they were alive. It was clear now this was no mere artifact. This was a control center, a relic from the ancient Anusans, designed to manipulate the entire ecosystem. Every tree, every vine, every gust of wind had been part of their system. And it was now attacking them with a singular focus. Mira! Gideon shouted. Get to the console, now. Find a way to deactivate it. I can't. Mira's voice broke off in a strangled cry as the vine around her chest tightened. It's too strong. The ground trembled beneath them again, and the humming from the structure grew louder, almost deafening. The voice of the Anusan being flooded Gideon's mind again, pressing against his skull. like it was inside his brain, its thoughts crashing into his own. You have broken the system. You do not belong here. You will be consumed. There was a flicker in the back of his mind, a faint memory of something he had read in his research. Anus Prime wasn't just a colony, it was a trap designed by the Anusans to keep invaders away, to protect their planet from outsiders. It had been left dormant for millennia, until human colonists had triggered it with their presence. Gideon's pulse raced as he remembered the other piece of information. The core of the system, the heart of the machine, was the structure itself. If they could disable it, they could disrupt the vines, break the planet's defenses. The question was how. He yanked at the vine around his leg, but the more he pulled, the tighter it became. The presence in his mind was growing stronger, more oppressive, like an iron grip squeezing his thoughts. But then, something clicked. The runes on the structure weren't just decorative, they were part of the interface. The symbols were changing, pulsing, reacting to their movement. Gideon's breath hitched as he realized the structure wasn't simply a machine, it was responding to them. It wasn't just an interface, it was alive in its own way, a remnant of the Anusans' intelligence, their power. Brooks, Mira. Gideon gasped, his voice rough with urgency. Look at the structure. The symbols, they're changing. They're reading us. He turned to Elena, struggling against the vines, his mind racing. You were a soldier, right? You can help me with this. We need to find a way to interrupt the flow. There must be a way to sever its connection to the ecosystem. Elena's eyes, wide with fear, flicked to the structure. I don't know how, Harper. It's alive. How do you fight something like that? We have to use its own system against it, Gideon said, gritting his teeth. I think we need to feed it false data. Confuse it. Make it think we're part of the environment. If we can overload the system, maybe we can stop it from processing us as a threat. Mira was barely conscious, her body twitching as the vines continued to drain her energy. Gideon knew he didn't have much time. He had to act, now. Taking a deep breath, he shoved his hand into the tangle of vines holding him, trying to reach for his pack. He had a scanner, a rudimentary tool he'd brought along to map the planet's ecosystem. It was a long shot, but it might be enough to trigger the right response in the structure. Stay with me, Mira. Gideon shouted, reaching her side and yanking the vine off her chest. Her skin was pale, and her eyes fluttered, but she was still breathing. He grabbed her tablet from her limp hand, where she'd been working on the data they'd gathered earlier. It was worth a try if he could use the data from their research and feed it into the machine. Maybe it would confuse the system enough to disrupt its control. With shaky hands, he connected the tablet to the interface on the structure. The moment the data synced, the symbols on the metal surface began to pulse faster, their light growing more erratic. The tendrils constricted around him tighter, but Gideon didn't pull away. He had no choice now. If this didn't work, they were all going to die. Mira stirred beside him, groaning as the vines withdrew slightly, like the structure was considering its options. Gideon pressed on, focusing all his energy on the tablet, entering a series of commands based on his research. He was feeding the structure contradictory data, information that didn't fit its programming. Information that made it think they were native to the planet, and then, just as the machine seemed to respond to the influx of data, a powerful jolt of energy shot through the vines, causing them to recoil. Gideon's body jerked, and the entire clearing lit up with an intense, blinding green glow. The force was too much. Gideon felt his consciousness begin to slip, his vision darkening at the edges. Just before he lost consciousness, he heard the voice again, though this time it was more distant, almost mournful. You have broken the cycle. And then, everything went black. When Gideon regained awareness, the first thing he noticed was the silence. The storm had passed. The hum of the structure was gone. The vines were no longer tightening around him. They had retracted, slithering back into the ground like the pulse of an ancient, dying creature. The world around him felt different. As if the planet was no longer watching them. He blinked, disoriented, and looked around. Elena was kneeling beside him, her face streaked with dirt and sweat, but her expression was one of relief. "We did it," she said, her voice shaky. "You did it." Gideon couldn't speak at first. He was too tired, too drained. But slowly, as the haze lifted from his mind, the reality of what had happened started to sink in. The ecosystem of Anus Prime was still alive, but the machine had been disrupted. They had broken the control. He turned toward Mira, who was still unconscious but breathing steadily. The vines had loosened their grip, but her body was pale, weakened by the strange energy siphon. Elena, seeing his concern, reached out to check on her. "She'll be okay," Elena said. "The worst is over." But even as the words left her mouth, Gideon felt a deep unease settle in his gut. They had survived, yes. But they had uncovered something far more dangerous than they had ever expected. The Anusans hadn't just engineered this planet. They had built it as a weapon, a last line of defense, a tool to safeguard their legacy against the kind of colonial greed humanity brought with it. "Is it over?" Mira asked, her voice barely a whisper as she opened her eyes. Gideon looked at the ruins of the structure, the broken vines, the still forest. It wasn't over. Not really. Anus Prime had a pulse, and it had been disturbed. The Anusans had left something behind and they hadn't fully understood it. None of them had. "No," he said softly, shaking his head. "It's just the beginning." End of story.